So good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session. It's great to have you with us. My name is Dr. Bill Tiplady. I'm the co-chair with Adrian Whittington of the PPN, the Psychological Professions Network in the South East. And I'm really pleased to be co-chairing this session this morning with Margot Onanaye, who's going to be talking to us in just a moment. So I'm going to kind of pass on to her after I've said a few introductory words. I'm going to give in a minute an overview of the kind of session today and the speakers that we've got lined up. But first of all, if we go on to the next slide, I think that will take us to some of the housekeeping information. So we've got a Slido open, and I guess people who've joined other sessions this week will be familiar with how that works. Please put your questions in the Slido window for us. Please do also put kind of comments or thoughts in there. We're also interested to hear about what you think the Psychological Professions Network should be doing in this space. What would really help us is if you are putting in a question, just put a couple of question marks at the beginning, and that will help us kind of filter out questions from other comments and thoughts. And the session will be recorded today, so if you want to be anonymous in your question or your comment, then please use that option as you put it into Slido. The other thing for Slido is if we've tried really hard to filter acronyms out and to explain them. If there is an acronym that slips in that you don't know what it means, please just pop that in the Slido. We'll do our best then to demystify. So as people, I guess, will know, the Psychological Professions Network is a free membership network which aims to bring together the 12 psychological professions and to inform, enable and influence NHS healthcare provision and maximise the influence of the psychological professions. And each of our days is themed. So today's theme is Unite and Increase Diversity in the Psychological Professions. I think diversity in the psychological professions is an area that hasn't always had the recognition and focus that it should have. And I think we have to acknowledge that there continue to be inequities in our workforce, in our training intakes, a need for reform and development of our curricula and our models of practice, and a need for us to ensure that we have a diverse and representative workforce and they're made to feel welcome and valued and included in our midst. So I think I foreground this session with that statement that this is a really, really important area. I think if we go on to the next slide, we've now got a nice video clip to kind of summarize this particular theme about uniting and increased diversity. So if you want to play the video, Matt.
We know. You've seen many a vision come and go. We're trying to do something different here. In 2020, we went on a journey to co-create a more impactful and unified future for the 12 psychological professions so that we can deliver the best possible care and support for everyone in our communities. We had over 1,800 people coming together to share over 12,000 ideas, comments and votes about our vision for the future of the psychological professions and the commitments we must all make to achieve our visionary goals. A vision for the psychological professions. To transform lives and communities by extending and embedding psychological knowledge and practice across the whole of health and care. Here are just some of the commitments. Unite and increase diversity in the psychological professions. Work together to make a bigger impact than we can alone. Make our psychological professions more representative of the communities we serve. Increase fairness of entry to and inclusion in the psychological professions for talented people of all backgrounds, particularly ethnic minority candidates. Establish clear career paths and development opportunities for all psychological professions. Now, we want to make this vision real. We want to bring it down from these visionary planets to our blue and green planet Earth and connect it with everyday life. We are calling this process the Intergalactic Bridge. Over the next few months, join us in creating the Intergalactic Bridge. Tell us what's been working for you and your ideas on how to make this real. We'd love to hear from you.
So another, really fantastic video there, and I would really want to echo that. We really do want to hear from you about what we can be doing as the Psychological Professions Network to be continuing with the work that needs to be done to increase diversity in our workforce and our practice. So to give a really brief intro to what we've got coming up, I'm going to hand across to Margot in a moment, who is going to tell us about some of the initiatives that have been being rolled out this year, health education supported initiatives to increase diversity both in training and in practicing providers. And as part of that, we'll hear from Paul, our expert by experience, who's kindly contributed to today's session and will be joining us later on to answer questions. Then we're going to hear from Rajni Sharma, who's going to tell us about similar initiatives in child psychotherapy and share some of her thoughts and perspectives about the journey she's been through and the process of walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And then we're going to shift from training to practice, and we're going to hear from Sarah Erskine, who'll be telling us about Synergy Leads and her experience of work in public health to target racial inequity and access to mental health services, where psychological thinking has made a really strong contribution. And I thought it was nice to include that because I think it illustrates the impact which psychological professions can have on the wider system. Then we'll take some questions. So for now, I'm going to hand across to Margot.
Thanks, Bill, and good morning, everybody. So let me formally introduce myself. My name's Margot, and I'm the South East Psychological Professions Network Widening Participation Lead, and I'm also the Programme Director for the Doctorate in Clinical Psychology Programme at the University of Southampton. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this workshop today because there have been some incredibly positive initiatives that are happening out there across the country that we wanted to show you today. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And we're going to start this initiative where we absolutely should start, which is hearing from Paul. I'd like to emphasize this is a pseudonym that Paul's using, and he's going to be talking about his experience of care from his perspective. Start the video, please, Matt.
My personal experience was that I received an open-minded and culturally sensitive service. It didn't merely take the conceptualized textbook definition of my culture, but the individual, CPN, and professional asked questions relating to what was important to me personally. They built upon my communication of my upbringing, both within an ethnic culture as well as within my family setting and religious beliefs. I believe through humbleness, for instance, not approaching my care as a professional or an expert, as in, oh, I've seen this before, or I've heard this before, but as someone who is getting to know another unique person in order to guide and aid them in their journey. We'll say Jim was able to achieve what I have yet to see others achieve, to be honest. And I'm very much in gratitude for that. I believe the fact that they express compassion without overprotectiveness, and being able to take off stabilizers. For instance, if you imagine the analogy of a child with stabilizers on their bike, there comes a time or point in that training where the stabilizers need to come off. From a psychological perspective, I believe this term is used commonly as well. Through promoting and exploring of short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. They also explained what these are and how they will align with my personal needs and drive towards recovery and sustainable well-being. The professional in question would be prepared for each catch-up session as well, and they'll be able to build on previous sessions and discussions through a structured approach, starting always with a brief recap of what was previously discussed and then building on this. Within a year, we were able to work together to a level of being able to challenge my personal comfort zones to work on bettering and empowering myself towards the set of goals previously put in place. I believe these were also reviewed consistently to see where I was in my mental psychological well-being journey. This helped very, very much in my recovery.
Thank you, Paul. And I think what Paul said at the beginning really sets the scene for me and the work that I do, in that the service that Paul accessed meant that he had open-minded and a culturally sensitive service. And of course, to deliver that, we need open-minded and culturally competent clinicians from a range of backgrounds to support that delivery. So next, I'd like to move on to hearing about aspiring psychologists and what their needs are. So over to you, Matt.
I hope to gain a bit of a better understanding about the day-to-day life of a psychologist, more than kind of what you read online. I kind of hope to be able to develop a bit of a better understanding of my skills and also my weaknesses, and what I need to work on that'll make me a better candidate for training. I hope to get a bit of support for my doctorate application and kind of ultimately to just be in a better position to apply for training. I think kind of understanding, I think when it's kind of aimed at people from BAME backgrounds, I guess understanding how different everyone's experience would have been and how there may have been quite negative experiences, and kind of being mindful of that and making sure that mentors are mindful of that as well. I think kind of the guidance in networking, like where to go. I know that I found it really helpful once I started the kind of finding LinkedIn groups and stuff like that to join that were aimed at BAME, people from BAME backgrounds, and that kind of thing. Yes, and networking.
So it's really helpful to hear there that people aspiring to come into the psychological professions, what they hope to gain from the variety of mentorship opportunities that are out there. Particularly in the clinical psychology world at the moment, most programs are offering mentorships to people from racially and ethnically minoritized communities to help them to access training. And also out there are, next slide please, a range of external EDI initiatives that are just frankly astounding. So I'd like to move on to the recordings to hear what good work is going on there at the moment. Play the video.
I've recognized that there's been a gap in representation of South Asian men within psychology and as clinical psychologists. So as a first step, I developed an initial survey just to hear from men and just to see how much interest there would be in developing a space which would support aspiring psychologists, South Asian men who are wanting to become psychologists into the profession, but to also support those who are already in the profession. So I developed the survey, I sent it out, and I had over 50 responses from men, and overall there's been really positive responses from men for wanting to have a space like this. So the next step would be to have a focus group and then to develop the space from that.
Co-founders of SnapBAM, which is an online LinkedIn community for aspiring clinical psychologists from ethnic minorities. There's 700 members of us, and that ranges for people doing their A-levels, undergrads, graduates as well. So that includes PWP, CBT therapists, and qualified and trainee clinical psychologists. We work to promote knowledge about UK-based courses that relate to the clinical psychology doctorate, and our community members are both UK and internationally based. Within the LinkedIn group itself, We network and share resources about the field, but also things relating to diversity, such as racism and things like that. We run webinars, So we run webinars, workshops, reflective sessions, and study groups. And our latest webinar was with UEA, UCL, Southampton, and Newcastle.
Since November last year, I've been admin of a Facebook group called Pre-Qual Clinical Psychologists with Disabilities and/or Health Conditions. So within that, I share resources, job adverts of interest. In spring last year, I conducted 9 mock interviews with aspiring trainees. Over the last couple of months, I've supported members to be matched with current or incoming trainees to read over applications. Recently, I hosted a webinar with the Newcastle Disabilities Lead, the Trust EDI Lead, and a qualified clinical psychologist who is alumni from the Newcastle course, who had navigated complex adjustments. Student chair of the Disabilities Workstream, along with Newcastle's Deacon's Disabilities Lead. We have an upcoming Advanced Supervisors workshop and a group of trainers in clinical psychology workshop over the next couple of weeks, and where we're going to talk about some of the difficulties that are experienced by aspiring and trainee psychologists with disabilities, but also how we can improve things in terms of reasonable adjustments.
So my experience has been really positive. I've seen how, from looking at the responses and from some of the messages on social media, that a lot of people have said that there's been a gap and that they would really like a space like this. So I think that seeing that there is a need for this, and that seeing how this is something very personal to being from the population, being a man, being South Asian, and I feel like it's been really positive. And that has helped me with me thinking about what comes next and to help with me continuing with developing this space. So that's been really good.
We have cherished, in all honesty, connecting with many people from diverse backgrounds on a national level, and have found such experience quite validating and normalizing. Particularly the emotions of frustrations around the challenges of getting into the doctorate program. We have found community in SNAPBAM where we can name racism and systemic issues which impact people from minority backgrounds getting an admission into the course. Of course, on a professional growth level, it has been it has led to so many opportunities for us. So opportunities to access several other spaces and become part of the system as well.
Firstly, it's been an absolute privilege to be part of it. Obviously with the group, that was very much something that I did privately and in my own time. But once our course disabilities lead, we just had an informal discussion, and that got, I guess, outed. That then obviously snowballed into all these other opportunities, which just is an absolute honour and privilege to be a part of, to hear other people's stories, to be able to make their voices heard in some small way. It isn't without some of the difficulties, but for me, it is one of the reasons why I wanted to be a clinical psychologist, was to make the profession a better place.
A challenge is how, because this is an initiative that I came up with, and I'm doing with my own time, I think this is something that's quite tough, because I feel like with me balancing working in a new full-time job as a clinical psychologist and then finding time to continue with this initiative, I think that's something that's quite been quite tough. But then because I feel like there's no one that's sort of supporting me or funding me to do this, it's something that I've come up with myself. But then I think I remember how that part of this work is part of helping to reduce some of those inequalities in representation And also I remember that is something very close to me and something very personal to me as well, and that's something that has helped. So I think that's just been a challenge, but I feel like it won't be something that would stop me from developing this space.
First challenge is for us to sort of agree on the eligibility criteria for our group. So this was a challenge for two reasons. So firstly, we're both Black African women, and we came across so many people from different backgrounds, which is so rich in so rich and diverse, which is so beautiful to see. But we came across a lot of identities they weren't necessarily familiar with. So in that, we took some time to learn and reflect about that, and even, I guess, uncover some of our own unconscious bias. But yeah, I think after that, we took time, we learned, and then, yeah, I guess, yeah, we learned a lot from it. And then after learning, the second challenge is that we wanted to include everyone, but that just wasn't possible because we wanted to stay niche and making sure that everyone that is included in the group sort of goes through the main challenge, which is racism within the field.
Time, so mostly, at least initially, it mostly being me from the students' side up to this point. And I guess more, as I mentioned earlier, sort of more formally getting involved with the course. I was doing the Facebook side of things completely independently and in my own time, which as a trainee you don't have much of. So trying to balance course requirements, placement, as well as all of the other things that I've got my toe in, has been a challenge. I think as well as something in feeling overly responsible for a lot of the work that's going on, but at the same time being really conscious that I don't speak for everybody. I don't want to silence anybody. I don't necessarily want to be a complete poster girl for this. I want to encourage more conversation rather than being the conversation. And at the same time, at being a trainee with a chronic health condition, I have to balance my health alongside all of that.
There is work currently being done, but I feel more work can be done to help support aspiring professionals from less represented backgrounds into training. So having more visibility, having more conversations about clinical psychology in careers day, in schools, in colleges, at university, because I know that's something I didn't have. So having that visibility, but then supporting those people into clinical psychology and courses, reviewing their admissions processes, but also then on clinical psychology training courses, having spaces to support minoritized trainees and having those safe spaces, and in services being able to talk about difference, race, culture, religion, sexuality, gender, being able to bring up these aspects of identity and talk about them in a safe space.
That more emotional support are provided for applicants who applied to the DCLIN courses but did not get the place. I know that for me, going through the process, it's quite infuriating in all honesty, and it leaves you with a lot of anxiety, and that's in 9 months of anxiety. I feel like we would also like to see that kind of the whole application process being reevaluated, because calculating it is 9 months of anxiety and 9 months of stress. Another thing we would very much like to see is more transparency. So almost like a top-down approach of feeding back any EDI, psychology-related work across the different university systems, across the different psychological professions. As we often see that people who need to hear this sometimes do not get this information. Zero tolerance to racism in all the psychological professions, in the different settings and the different universities, in the different work areas.
Less silence is the main thing. There was a research paper, and research is scarce in this area, that suggested that there is a massive silence within the training community for clinical psychology in regards to disability and health conditions. I think alongside that, courses maybe need to be a bit more flexible in terms of their provision. It's really tricky when you do have a chronic health condition and the course is unrelenting in terms of the demands, and I'm very well supported, don't get me wrong, but I think generally as a training community there needs to be a lot more acceptance of being more flexible in terms of maybe offering more part-time initiatives, and it not being something that's kind of hidden away and has to be asked for very explicitly and within a certain process.
So thank you to our presenters there, and every time I listen to what Shah, Glenn, Mary and Victoria have to say, it astounds me the amount of work that they're putting into this to support people from a range of backgrounds to access clinical psychology training. Some are clinical psychology only, some are psychological professions. So having heard kind of some of the great initiatives that are out there, we're now going to move on to hear about what local clinical psychology programs, and the reason why we've chosen clinical psychology at the moment is because there's been a huge push behind the scenes to ensure that clinical psychology becomes more inclusive. And so there's some excellent work that's happening out there that other courses can learn from and develop from. And also a local trust in our region, Sussex Partnership, who are going to talk about some of the work they're doing. Over to you, Matt.
For our widening access initiatives, we're working at several different levels. We've got a trainee widening access champions group that are developing talks to deliver in schools to highlight clinical psychology as a possible profession to people who might not have had that on their radar at all ever before. We're working with other London programmes to build a larger and more comprehensive mentoring scheme for aspiring clinical psychologists from global majority backgrounds. We're also working on our admissions processes to identify where there are points of bias or where there are potential obstacles. We've got some research underway to identify barriers and concerns that applicants have when they're filling in their equal opportunities form that comes with their application. And one of the reasons that we're focusing on that is that we really need that information to be able to identify where the biases and problems in our processes are, and also to allow us to apply positive action in our admissions processes. So we want to really get to the crux of where the concerns are still remaining about that so that we can do something about it. We've also built a lot of transparency around our admissions processes in the last year. We've shared a lot of data, we've answered every possible question in as much detail as possible so that we can demystify the process and make sure that applicants who are coming from a range of different backgrounds and career settings have got an equal footing.
So we've been working really hard, as I'm sure all courses have, to try and think about the support available for aspiring psychologists, current trainees, but also supervisors that are linked to the course as well. So in terms of aspiring psychologists, we have set up a mentoring scheme. So that's called the Mind to Mind mentoring scheme for us. And that's been developed through consultation with undergraduate students from Reading University, but also linking with 2 assistant psychologists that we've recruited to help us with the work. And they are both from minority ethnic backgrounds and come with experience of what it might be like to face barriers in terms of getting into clinical psychology as a profession. So we also, through that work, we've set up a equity of access group in which we invite undergraduate students, the assistant psychologists, course staff, but also regional supervisors as well, to come together so that we can collaboratively think about how we can focus on the EDI agenda for the course. And for each meeting, so we've had a meeting each month and we've basically set a topic that links to the HEE funding. So we've thought about supervision training, we've thought about mentoring, we've thought about the curriculum, and also support for current trainees.
We're doing quite a lot. We started this programme by really wanting to make sure that we had the right data, looking at what our representation was in the different psychological professions at different grades within the trust. And we also wanted to look at the pathways from a sort of sixth form college psychology all the way through to entering our services for people interested in psychology as a career. And from that research, we really identified 4 key areas we wanted to work on. The first was to secure funding to support the creation of paid assistant psychology roles. This was something that was then fortunately taken up by NHSE, and we were able to secure not only money from the trust but NHSE to provide specific placements for people from an ethnic minority background. And the fundamental aim of that is to try and bridge the current gap between undergraduate training and successful entry onto postgraduate clinical applied psychology courses, where there is a real drop-off in the number of BAME applicants being successful.
We've made some changes to our shortlisting criteria just to kind of help it be more inclusive. And with our interview panels, we're doing what we can to ensure that we have at least one representative on each panel from an underrepresented population within clinical psychology. We started this last year and it has been quite effective. So for the year that we've got exiting, and we've had one person from an ethnically diverse background, and with the cohort that we've just had started in, we've had 10 out of 33, so just under a third of them are from underrepresented backgrounds. We've also thought about how we can decolonise the curriculum. So we've had our module leads work through, liaise with our external lecturers to think about having EDI as sort of flowing through our modules, so that it's not like an ad hoc sort of session or lecture. We've also just launched our mentoring scheme for aspiring clinical psychologists from BAME backgrounds, and we have delightfully exceeded our expectation for the number of mentees that we thought we would have.
I think we've learned to be patient in the face of the slow pace of change. I think we came with a certain energy and enthusiasm to get things going, and we've had to learn to be patient and to follow process and to challenge in a particular way in order to get things done. We've had to learn to be brave as well, to try things and to get things wrong, and to receive feedback and to reevaluate and go away and learn and to try again. But I think we've also learned to be compassionate to the feedback that we give each other, and that's kind of as a whole programme, as a staff team and with trainees across our whole cohorts. There's been a lot of work for us all, I think, to have that bravery but also that compassion.
I think, also one of the learning points is about how we consider working with diversity in a sensitive way, and recognising that it's really important for trainees to have role models within the profession, to see people from similar ethnic minority backgrounds. I guess, we're talking about EDI, so it's not just about race and ethnicity. I think it's, really key that we think about both visible and invisible differences as well, and think about intersectionality in terms of our topics that we're teaching, the speakers that we have, and also, I guess, providing appropriate support and training for supervisors and facilitators on the course as well.
That it's been really important that this is a programme of work co-developed and co-constructed between the leadership team and people with lived experience of working through these challenges. So the Ethnic Minority Forum, PPT, Ethnic Minority Forum, has been really important in helping challenge our thinking, and to make sure that we're not accidentally enacting out biases, assumptions.
For me, what I've learned is that, unfortunately, despite it being 2021, there is very little groundwork to go from to kind of build these initiatives build these off. I've spoken to several EDI leads across different courses, and our general sense is that, you know, we are at the moment building from the ground up. We'll be kind of collecting evidence as we go along. So yeah, it'll just be learning from each step we take, and there'll be mistakes which we can hopefully learn from and apply in future years to kind of help build on these initiatives.
I think engaging everybody in the work. I think there's been points in our work where it's felt like it's fallen to the same individuals to move things forward. And I mean that across the programme, the university, across clinical trusts, even within trainee cohorts. So that's been a real challenge, making sure everybody's engaged in the work.
Just being aware that not everybody may feel comfortable talking about diversity, and recognising that people may be at different points in their journey. So I think what's been key is trying to think about what support people may need at various points.
How do you create opportunities for people from disadvantaged backgrounds? This really is the key one, without accidentally discriminating against people from other backgrounds. And what we're really trying to do with that is create sort of person specs and roles that are really asking people and requiring people to draw on their own experiences of disadvantage, their own experiences of living in particular communities, and bring that into the work they're doing within the trust.
The biggest challenge that I've noticed on a level has been the emotional impact and realization of how big of a gap there is in clinical psychology when it comes to, you know, EDI matters. But I have to say that, you know, the response that we've had within our regions from our supervisors, mentors, external lecturers, you know, and our programme team, everybody's response has been very willing, very open to have these quite difficult conversations.
We're building a team approach to try and help maintain those energy levels and to take care of each other, especially our colleagues and our consultants from global majority groups, recognising the additional burden that they experience doing the work. We're working closely with our clinical trusts to try and embed the work in their processes to kind of increase that engagement and to support the engagement from supervisors. But we're also trying to make sure that the work is embedded in the training throughout to support engagement with trainees and to give them space to do that work and to take part in that work.
I think I'd really like to increase our links with other courses, so around our region. I wonder whether there might be a possibility of doing some joint events. I think that would be really useful in terms of kind of pooling expertise together. I'd also really like to think about training and support we can provide for facilitators and supervisors that provide teaching on our course, I guess, to try and think about how we can authentically weave discussions around diversity into teaching and training, so that we're not having conversations in particular sessions only and that's not carried through, or just having conversations within the EDI stream of teaching. But I suppose my hope is really that we are able to have that discussion more widely, because I think that's how we actually introduce systemic change.
I think what we really do need to do as a system is continue to really look at the data that we have on people's career choices and pathways. And I'd want to do two things. I'd want to make sure that at every layer of that journey, where we seem to be disproportionately selecting, for example, people from a white, and in many psychological professions, female, you know, and mostly middle class, where we're making those selections, could we be accidentally discriminating against other groups of people from different backgrounds because of the way that we're constructing interviews, because of the type of work experience that people need to gain?
I think we are thinking about how we can sort of reach out to sort of at an earlier stage to reach aspiring clinical psychologists, maybe from secondary school, college, undergraduate stages, just to kind of help them on their journey into clinical psychology and consider it. That's one of the barriers that we notice from those from underrepresented backgrounds into coming into clinical psychology. So we're going to try and think about some outreach work that's in progress at the moment, learning from other EDI leads as well, or kind of sharing resources and just trying to build on.
Thank you. And thank you to Catherine, Rena, Nick and Amel there for talking about some of the initiatives they are doing. And I just want to re-clarify that even though this was, well, besides Nick, talking about the initiative in clinical psychology, we are sharing these initiatives across the psychological professions. Indeed, that's part of my role within the Psychological Professions South East, is to make sure that the good examples of practice are being shared across the myriad of psychological professions. The reason why we chose clinical psychology is I'm a clinical psychologist, so I know what some of the good work that's being done there, and as I said before, the kind of initiatives currently within clinical psychology. But yep, we're talking to all the professions and sharing where we can. But of course, we're not quite there yet. There are many barriers and things that we need to consider within the psychological professions to help increase diversity from a range of backgrounds. So not only from a racial, ethnic perspective, but also from an identity perspective, from a disabilities, from a low socioeconomic status perspective, gender, all the unrepresented kind of populations there are across the psychological professions. But we have to start somewhere. And to start somewhere, then start building those bridges brick by brick by brick to help improve inclusivity across. So lots more work to be done. Outreach activities, getting there, talking to people at all stages of their development. And I am passionate. So I was at the trainers conference earlier this week, and I was talking about the need to support people whilst on training as well, and the importance of having different support structures for people from the range of backgrounds that we're hoping to recruit into the training. Because as Marion Glee said, there's diversity within diversity. We're all diverse. We all have an identity, we all have a value and a belief system, and we need to make sure we're supporting as much as we can those different systems. I've also done some research recently looking at the need to train our supervisors to help them to deliver culturally competent supervision. And of course, I could also widen that to be intersectionality, to really help supervisors to think about how they have those conversations and how that would impact on the clinical work that an individual was doing. Transparency and feedback during the training application process. I mean, it was interesting. I was looking at the Slido and some of the comments that were on there that really aren't the case. And so there does need to be a transparency across all the professions. And thinking about people with health conditions, neurodiversity, and making sure we're supporting those. I mean, programs now have people from a range of backgrounds with a range of neurodiverse conditions that we are looking to support, and there's support in place. I'm really helping to reduce that emotional burden and thinking about how we can do that in a safe way. So to finish this part of the workshop, I'd like to finish where we started and hearing words from Paul, our expert by experience.
Personally, what this looks like to me and what it resembles is fast, efficient and effective, well prepared, open-minded, compassionate, challenging, humbling and understanding. Obviously there's plenty more, and each individual is different. However, needless to say, the professionalism of the individual, the individual CPN, and their ability to understand through experience of the service and the use of non-biased rapport building, their question techniques, their long-term well-being of myself, is all part of the mix, to be honest, in order to maintain that long-term goal. and achieve that long-term goal with the medium-term and short-term goals put into place and coincide with that. Needless to say, that to be able to achieve this level of synergy or even co-production and inclusion and holistic approach, it is important to remember that the foundations of sound trust and rapport should be placed. When caring for a person who has experienced trauma, for instance, it is important to first try and understand what this feels like for that individual service user and help them overcome any stigmas or barriers they may face in everyday life. It is the human part of interaction that makes the final difference. Personally, I believe that the best approach is to enjoy what we do and approach with less expert attitude. For instance, I know it already, heard it all before. No unique person is the same as another at the end of the day.
Thanks, Paul. So moving on, there was obviously lots more good initiatives and work that's been done out there that we couldn't hope to include within our short time frame. And for those of you from an LGBTQ+ or have population or interested in that side of diversity, Nick Spinks has produced a YouTube video, and I believe these slides will be made available to you afterwards so you can see all the names of the contributors and the various links. And also the Exeter team have produced some work on trauma-informed anti-racism, and the link is there for you as well. Next slide, please. Would like to, of course, say a massive thank you to all of those who contributed today. Our apologies for the fact that the earlier slides were masked by the interpreters, but of course it's very important they're there in the view of inclusivity, and we managed to write that. But here's all the names of the people who inputted in today's session, and where we have links to various groups, we've put those links in, particularly to SnapBAM and also Victoria's Face group around disability. So those links are there for you, and you will be able to access this information afterwards. Big thank you to everybody. And hopefully we've been able to demonstrate today some good work being done. Of course, there's much more work to be done. Of course, there's work to be done across the range of inclusivity that's needed. But hopefully what we've shown you today is that there is a start for us to work from. And with that in mind, I'd like to hand over to Rajni Sharma now, who's going to talk about some work in her area.
Thank you, Margot, and thank you, everybody. It's really good to be here today. I'm feeling quite anxious, and I'm kind of reflecting on whether the anxiety is an ordinary one in relation to presenting, or whether there is something particular about this topic that generates an intensification of anxiety. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a child and adolescent psychotherapist who's worked in the NHS for over 25 years. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experiences of working within the profession. So, unlike some of the 12 psychological professions and broader family of mental health professionals, child and adolescent psychotherapy falls well short of being a representative profession, particularly in relation to ethnicity, class, disability, and religion. We fare better in relation to sexual orientation, but even this is complicated with the stance that psychoanalysis and child psychotherapy as a psychoanalytic profession has historically taken in relation to homosexuality. Child and adolescent psychotherapists are mainly white, middle-class women, and the revolutionary events of the last 2 years have generated an impetus and energy to finally begin to face this stubbornly intractable problem in my profession. But before I go on to discuss the changes that are taking place, it's necessary to take stock and garner some understanding of past failings. Not to blame, persecute, or become helpless about the covert and at times overt discrimination and biases that were in play, but to take responsibility for them within our professional identity and to learn from them. Some of you here will not have heard of child and adolescent psychotherapy or know that it is a core NHS profession which came into existence over 70 years ago at the same time as the NHS. We are small in number and in that sense a minority profession. To train as a child and adolescent psychotherapist, it involves a 4-year full-time training that is structured around a training post within a child and adolescent mental health service, a doctoral programme of clinical and research learning within a psychoanalytic frame of reference, integrating with developmental, attachment and systemic perspectives. The length of training and requirement to be in a minimum of 4 times a week personal psychoanalysis for the length of the training has meant that for many decades that only those that could afford to take on such a long-term expensive training could train as child psychotherapists. It's only over the last 25 years or so that the training has been publicly funded. And over recent years, this has been through Health Education England. It is public funding that enabled me to train and work in the NHS as a child and adolescent psychotherapist for the last 20 years. I couldn't have done so otherwise. As a second-generation Asian woman with a father who could not work due to ill health and a mum who did piecework as a seamstress, the only way we could afford for me to go to university was through full bursaries that were available for low-income families. Without the structure of a fully publicly funded child psychotherapy training post, I could not have progressed to train as a child psychotherapist, a profession that I fell in love with when I was first supervised by a child psychotherapist for some play therapy work I was doing with a little girl who had suffered sexual abuse. Like many kids and young people of colour that grew up in the 80s, it was not unusual for me to be the only brown or black person in the room. So being in that situation when I trained was a barely noticeable fact. I think it would have been more of a shock to me if there was more ethnic diversity. I was blindly unquestioning about the issues of equality, diversity and inclusion in my training, despite being active politically. It was almost as if I left this outside the door when I trained and worked as a child psychotherapist. This is likely to be an overgeneralization, but I do think there is some truth to that. I have now been working as a child and adolescent psychotherapist for a long time, worked in many different contexts, but for most of it, the place for questioning the lack of representation in child psychotherapy and how this impacts the communities we serve and our professional and clinical effectiveness has been subsumed under other pressing priorities, such as fighting for the need for psychotherapy to be accessible for families within public sector services, particularly outside London and the South, hence the creation of the Northern School of Child and Adolescent Psychotherapy, which is based in Leeds. We've been really prioritising the need to attend to issues such as efficacy and evidence base and trying to work our way to have a place at the multidisciplinary table. No doubt the concerns about being a largely white middle-class female profession have been raised, but we've not been able to materially address this. It's the thing that gets debated with everyone nodding and agreeing it's a problem and something that needs to be done about it. At times, outside consultancy has been invested in and action plans written, and then another year passes without tangible movement. Maybe it takes a pandemic and the horrific murder of George Floyd to sucker punch a multilateral approach across every section of society, a collective engagement that is compelling, holding to account and energising. That has certainly been the case for child and adolescent psychotherapy. The difficult conversations are being had, forums where bitter truths of racism, homophobia and elitism within the profession have been effaced. the terrible discomfort and intense guilt has had to be suffered and is being suffered. I think this is increasing insight and recognition that the microaggressions, intellectual theorizing, and middle-class moderation are just as corrosive as the overt acts of hatred and marginalization that we are so readily able to condemn. The investment by HEE to enable bursaries to level up the playing field for underrepresented people to access the training is being targeted and evaluated to best ensure that this does lead to diversification. Within the training, we've been alert to minimising didactic teaching on diversity, the soul-destroying mandatory type of training where everyone nods that the isms are wrong and we should all do better. Instead, we are learning from the experts in the field, drawing on colleagues and professions that have been more successful in developing a diverse workforce, such as social work and counselling, and mining the riches of our own psychoanalytic approaches. We've been clear that to better support our trainees' prioritised engagement with difference and diversity learning, we as trainers have to meaningfully address it, up close and personal. As a training team at the Northern School of Child and Adolescent Psychotherapy, we attend monthly work groups. We bring direct experiences of the dynamics of difference, how they have arisen in our work and our identity. It is a learning from experience, an experiential approach, and boy have we had some heated and painful conversations. We've recognised that we are engaging in the work with a level of, if we are engaging in the work with a level of articulacy and steadiness, we are not doing the work. When we are talking about experiences that are shameful, disturbing, and impossible to wrap words around, then we are in the territory of real learning. For example, the racist thought that bubbles up with a black trainee who turns their camera off in a Zoom seminar, or the sliding over a theme about sexuality in a theory paper that has the possibility of homophobic undertones, or the colour blindness that occurs when supervising a psychotherapy session between a white trainee and a Middle Eastern teenager whose family fled persecution. If we cannot work on this together as a training team, how can we meaningfully and deeply support our trainees' development in this area? These training team work groups are new and need a lot of commitment and looking after. They often feel on the edge of fragmentation when we're all tired, pulled in multiple directions, and at times feeling hopeless about whether it will make a difference. But my sense is that it's through this deep depth of emotional work that real change is beginning to take place. This change looks like an authentic interweaving of difference and diversity across all aspects of the curriculum. Not lip service extension of reading lists or bolted on training events, but integration of the issues of diversity in research, on modules on children looked after, or workshops on adolescent and parent and infant work, and really engaging with the reality that most of our theory and concepts, particularly seminal papers, have been generated from white middle-class men, and how do we constructively critique that without throwing the baby out with the bathwater? We have also been thinking about our training approach. Does meaningful attention to the hateful and splitting dynamics of discrimination and how it manifests in our work as child and adolescent psychotherapists require a more intimate teaching approach than usually takes place? What is the place for self-disclosure about identity in a teaching and supervisory relationship? We are getting in touch with the reality that we will say the wrong thing, inadvertently cause offence and make mistakes. We know that's inevitable in our work, but it is terribly hard to bear in relation to the challenges of diversity. But unless we have the courage to do that, we will not sustain the opportunities that have opened up in the last 2 years to ensure that we are a profession that reflects the communities that we serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Rejni. I think it was fantastic to hear about both what's been going on in your own kind of professional world and in the world of child psychotherapy, but also I think to hear such an insightful, set of thoughts about some of the challenges of doing that. I guess I'm very aware of my role in this area as a white middle class man, just as you said, as has dominated this field in so many ways, and the importance, I suppose, of being open to learning and open to making mistakes, open to getting things wrong, but not shying away from a potentially really difficult area where we do have to keep talking and keep thinking. So thank you very much for your thoughts and comments. We're going to move across now to hear from Sarah Erskine. So Sarah works in public health in Leeds and has been doing a piece of work with another of our PPN chairs, Sharon Prince, on looking at issues of kind of service access and inequalities and disparities in access to mental health services for people from Black and minority ethnic groups. So we'll go across now, Matt, to hear her presentation.
So hello everyone, and thanks for joining this session. My name is Sarah Erskine. I'm Head of Mental Health within the Public Health Directorate at Leeds City Council. I'm going to talk today about a piece of work I've been involved with for the last 4 years or so, working closely with psychology in Leeds, specifically Sharon Prince, who's Deputy Director of Psychological Professions at LYPFT, which is our acute mental health trust in Leeds. So I'm really going to talk about how I think this partnership is supporting really transformative action and processes in the city around ethnic inequalities in mental health. So I'm going to talk about how the project came to be and what it is, the role of psychology, and then I'm going to spend a little bit at the end talking about what I think are the really important relationships and points of intersection between public mental health and psychology. So in 2017, Public Health in Leeds produced the Leeds Mental Health Needs Assessment, and we looked at inequalities in access and experience and outcome for people from a variety of ethnic backgrounds. And in this, we included a piece of research which was done by Touchstone, a local third sector organisation in Leeds, and LYPFT. And this showed, as is elsewhere, evident across the country, that there was an over-representation of people from Black, Asian and mixed ethnic backgrounds detained on admission to mental health wards. I've put in bold here some of the very early challenges and problems that we experienced when we were trying to think about how we might address the inequality, the stark inequality that we found. And you'll see really, and you'll start to understand, I think, why it's been really important for us to take a psychologically informed approach to this work. So practitioners and strategic leaders alike felt unconvinced that action would result in change given multiple previous failed attempts. There was huge amounts of hurt and distrust and anger in the system that this was still an issue, and a real sense of not wanting to get involved because of previous experiences. And an early partnership group that we had really struggled to develop a coherent approach, decide on key actions, or agree a shared common language to discuss issues of risk, racism and discrimination. So literacy in the broadest sense was really low. People didn't know what language to use. People didn't understand the increased risk of severe mental illness and then how that was played out in services. There was a real fear and actually a real fear of trying to find out about it. And it was at that point that Leeds made contact with the National Synergy Collaborative Centre, who are funded by the Lankelly Chase Foundation to work with organisations, cities, groups of people across the country to address ethnic inequalities in mental health. And really the conversations that we had with the national team, particularly Professor Kambui, who some of you might know, who's a psychotherapist and a psychiatrist now at the University of Oxford, really helped us to frame what we were doing, frame the problem in a different way. And this ultimately helped us to develop a shared narrative around the problems and helped us to formulate a scaffolding for solutions. So the way that Synergy helped us, the National Synergy team helped us to think about this was that the reason this has been an issue for 50 or 60 years, and some of you will have read papers around the overrepresentation of some diverse communities that are literally 50 years old. So the reason for this is because service user voices are marginalised, difficult views or opinions are silenced, and people in positions of power, particularly people who are white, fear addressing the issue because they're afraid about getting it wrong. And really, when you accept that it's a very complicated whole system problem and those are some of the factors that contribute to it, then actually some of the solutions and the scaffolding for the work become a little bit clearer. So really, in talking and having that kind of psychologically informed coaching style conversation with Kambui and other people in the team, we developed scaffolding for the work. So how we think about it and our ethos and approach and principles is that we are really focused on surfacing racism and discrimination. We welcome difficult discussion, and we ensure service user and carer voices are at the heart of everything we do. In everything we do, we are trying to disrupt the kind of power structures and the power balances that have contributed to the problem that we're trying to address. So this slide shows all the different things that Synergy Leads is, and a really, really important central part of it is our network. The Synergy Leads network aims to energise and enable people to make changes within their own services and systems. So it's a group of people that meet every other month from all different sectors across Leeds who are passionate about reducing ethnic inequalities in mental health. As such, the network's grown to operate as a community of practice. We share ideas, we provide support, and we have really difficult discussions, which I'll talk about later, around developing services and action to address inequalities and how we can make things better in lots of different parts of the city. A core team supports the network function and this capacity building across the system. So we're really lucky that NHS Leeds have funded this work recurrently. So we have a worker who sits in my team who does fantastic work meeting communities, going out, influencing the system, and also a Children and Young People's post as well, which is hosted in the third sector. We've committed to creative spaces events, which are really brilliant events that centre experts by experience voices and also using creative methodology. So we really try and engage people in the system, system leaders, emotionally so that they feel motivated to make a change. And often we feel, and the National Synergy team feel, that this is best done through service user voices, but also creative approaches. The grants programme we're really proud of in Leeds. This is funded through the NHS Leeds funding for us, and it's delivered through Leeds Community Foundation. This supports local grassroots activity, so it supports delivery of mental health services by people in communities. It also delivers activity which we believe will reduce ultimately at a population level the risk of severe mental illness. And it also, one of the other things that we were keen to fund was work that was around reducing stigma and improving trust. We do wider capacity building with grassroots organisations, not just those who are grants recipients. So we're supporting lots and lots of organisations to articulate the need that they're meeting, describe it, and be able to talk about that within wider strategic and ultimately, we hope, commissioning settings. And we're influencing outwards. So we're taking our approach and our principles, and we're using this to inform wider programmes, such as the Community Mental Health Transformation Programme and also Leeds Mental Health Strategy. So the role of psychology in this, what the national team provided to Sharon Prince and myself and other people in Leeds was real coaching and facilitation and support, particularly at the start of this work when there was a lot of fear about even sort of starting to think about it really. And then Sharon mirrors that really in how she supports and chairs and enables our network group. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that. So I'm really clear that I think we should have a psychologist involved in all partnership working going forward, because I think I've not been involved in a piece of work really where there is so much conflict and challenge, but it's handled so well. And we're really, I think, through the work, modelling how we want to model how we talk to service users and carers and how we think about systems. So we're really clear about surfacing what's going on. What are the conflicts? What's happening here? Of course, you're going to feel uncomfortable because you are addressing your privilege, for example. Focus on relationships, group culture and process, and this has really ensured ongoing commitment to a shared purpose and buy-in from diverse partners. And we're constantly centering reflective practice. Whose voice is not in the room? Will this make a difference? What is going to be the result of what we're doing? Okay, so on this slide, we have some quotes from people who attend the steering group. And I just think it's really useful to I think what's been really heartening about this work is that we've been working for many, many years now, 3 or 4 years on this project, and people who are involved, as you can see from the bottom, have started to say that this feels really different. So particularly I like the second quote on that slide and the second sentence in it. I also like the fact that people were able to talk openly about the need for appropriate representation when engaging with communities. It felt like a very safe space, which was positive. So I just thought I'd end, and please do get in contact with me or Sharon Prince at LYPFT if you'd like more detail about the project. But I thought I'd just end really by reflecting on the important relationship, I think, between public mental health and psychology. So in public mental health, what we're really interested in is describing population level mental health inequalities and how they are amplified by what happens in services. And I think psychology has that long history and that language around being able to really indicate and show that, and this is obvious, but it's very important, that these population level inequalities is really an amalgam, isn't it, and a scaling up of what happens to individuals and communities. And psychology, again, has a long history of talking about trauma, racism and discrimination as a determinant of mental ill health. And I think that's been really, really important. I think working with psychology, working with someone who was within the mental health service has enabled us to really support reflection within mental health services without it feeling threatening. And then I joked earlier, I was only half joking, about the fact that I think what has been really phenomenal for me is watching the way in which the clinical psychologist who's been involved in this work has enabled the work to be successful and has enabled the partnership working to be successful. So thank you for listening. Please do get in touch if you've got any more questions or you'd like to know more information about Synergy Leads. Thanks very much.
Wow, thank you, Sarah. I think certainly for me, hearing that as a clinical psychologist who came into the profession, thinking that this was about making a wider impact rather than just giving support to individuals, I think it's really fantastic to hear about that bit of work. And I think if the message was that there should be a psychological profession involved in all partnership working, then I, for one, would second that. We're getting towards the end of our session. We wanted now just to pick up on some of the questions in the Slido. It's been amazing to see the volume of questions and thoughts that have come in, and we won't be able to get to all of those, I'm afraid. I'm going to pick up on a couple now, then I'm going to hand across to Margot, then we'll hear from Paul, our expert by experience, a kind of final thought on the session, and then we'll aim to close by about 11:05, given that we started a little late. So there's a whole raft of kind of clinical psychology training related questions, and I'm afraid I'm going to defer on some of those to Margot. She may or may not welcome that pass. I wanted to pick up on a couple of other things that I've seen coming up, which means I'm kind of moving up and down the order a little bit. So firstly, there was a question about the kind of focus on clinical psychology. I noticed a comment from a counselling psychology colleague saying that I'm feeling discriminated against here. There's a lot of talk about clinical psychology, and obviously we have heard also about child psychotherapy today. I think that reflects really the first wave of kind of HEE focus, and so that's how we've reported it today. I think some of the work that Margot is going to be doing with us in the Southeast is looking across the 12 psychological professions and actually thinking about what are the issues that are similar or different across professions. So I think that's a fair comment and we acknowledge that, but I think that doesn't mean that that's where we think we ought to stop. And also, I suppose that's a kind of similar point about the broad range of different sorts of difference and disadvantage that we need to be mindful of and the way in which those can intersect. So I think that's a point well made. I think we've focused probably rightly, I think, on kind of race and culture in terms of a really particular source of disadvantage and difference, but that doesn't mean that we're not thinking about other issues. The other thing that I also picked up was this question, which I think is really important one, about is it that actually there's a received understanding in some communities, perhaps particularly in some ethnic minority communities, about what psychology is, what it means, whether that would be an attractive career to go into, whether that is something for me. And I think that is a really important point. I think, it's right that we focus on who's coming into training. It's right that we focus on my side in a trust about how we're recruiting and retaining staff from a range of backgrounds. But I think there is something much more upstream, actually. And I think some of that probably relates to the way that mental health services have operated and have often operated in a discriminatory way. And so it's not unreasonable that I think in some communities there would be a reluctance to think, is that a world I want to go into? So I think it really flags that there is a much wider mission here, I suppose, in how we have an impact as psychological professions on the way in which services are delivered, so that people can actually see, yes, that's something I would want to get involved with, but also that we do have those sort of conversations and debates with people further kind of upstream in their academic or training journey to actually help think about how we can make psychological professions really seem attractive to a really broad range of people, because I really do think the only way that we provide the right sort of services is by having the right sort of range of voices there to help us develop them. So I picked up on those couple of things. I'm going to now hand across to Margot to pick up on a couple of questions of her own.
Thanks, Bill. And again, I echo what Bill said there. It's really interesting to see the comments that are coming through on the Slido. I suppose the first thing I'd like to pick up on is there was a sort of theme of questions talking about representation from a range of people from racial and ethnic backgrounds needed throughout the psychological professions, including supervision, within training programs, and indeed within the network itself in relation to EBE representation. I 100% agree. 100% agree with those comments, but of course it takes time to make change, and we also need to value all our colleagues within the psychological profession, help them to learn, develop, and increase their knowledge in a range of diversity that we all come with. And I think there's more active kind of consideration of that now, and making sure that people are thinking in that way. And my hope is in the future we will see more diversity, because it is so needed throughout every aspect. There was a lot of questions about the application process. Obviously, I'm a program director for clinical training, but of course, I'm assuming people will talk about the variety of applications on the variety of psychological professions as well. My advice is really clear on this, that there should be no ism whatsoever within the application process. Now, that's me, my view, but of course, I'm a realist within that. But I always say to people, you need to put who you are, how much you want to put, and how much you feel comfortable to put. It could be your age, it could be the fact that you're a parent, it could be the fact you have a caring responsibility, it could be your value system, your religious beliefs, your ethnic identity. Whatever is important to you, you should feel comfortable enough to put into the application forms. And indeed, I was talking to the directors on Monday for clinical psychology and saying, we need to make sure our recruitment processes aren't biasing against people. So I think be true to yourself on any application that you make. And also, often people ask people to read their applications, which is fine, but make sure it's still you in there and that you're getting across what your value system and beliefs are. I must have read hundreds, thousands of applications in my time in training. The ones that are still in my mind are those people that have been true and honest to themselves. That's me, but that is how I experience it, and that's certainly the perspective from Southampton. Also, coming on to the point that Bill made about intersectionality, and somebody very rightly put, well, I don't tick a box, well, nor do I. I mean, what box do I tick as a mixed heritage woman from a low socioeconomic background with a previous career who trained in her later years? You know, so of course we all come with a variety of experiences. And again, with all the different incentives there are, pick which ones you think suit you and you'll represent you, but also there may be some that don't, and that's fine, because lots of what we're presenting today are transferable across different sets of differences. There was also quite a lot of comments about part-time training. It seems such an easy thing to ask for, but it's a really hard thing to make sure we get right and deliver. But that is something that we do need to look at more across the psychological professions to make sure that we can be fair to all. And that'd be something, as Bill was alluding to, that my work that I'll be making recommendations about the importance of all the psychological professions when training individuals to consider part-time routes, but with the caveat that there's lots of stakeholders involved in part-time route training, so it will take time to implement. But I think those are fantastic points, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Margot. I think definitely I would underline the thing about being yourself in any application you make. I think it's definitely true. You know, my perspective at the other end, I suppose, of seeing, you know, and working with psychological professions is that, you know, what makes you great at that job is not necessarily the kind of technical skills that you can highlight on your CV. It's who you are as a person. You know, that is a massive ingredient. So, you know, tell people about that and feel proud to do that. I know that in a way is easy for us to say, and in the past, of course, there have been, you know, processes where that hasn't perhaps always been as valued as it should, but I think that's definitely sound advice. So I'm going to hand over in a moment to Paul just to hear some closing thoughts from his perspective as an expert by experience. Paul's kind of joining us by audio, and then I'll come back to do the kind of final housekeeping. So over to you, Paul. What have you made of the session today, and what sort of thoughts would you want to leave us with?
Yeah, it's been a really good session in a sense of very illuminating and very sort of broad as well. However, there are 3 points that were sort of key in when I was listening. One point that Victoria made: less silence. Definitely, we need less silence in the profession. So people need to speak up about certain things that need to change. And also, Nick made another point about how when we're promoting for one group or certain groups of people, we can sometimes discriminate against other groups. I think this has happened, and Regina has highlighted that to an extent where she mentioned that child and adolescence and cultural representation is less than other areas, which is shocking, but it's a fact. It's a fact that we live with currently. There's also the reflection on in psychology, fight or flight. I just want to sort of like highlight another sort of conceptualization to that, which is why don't we bring challenge and develop to that instead of fight and flight? Because people usually think, you know, there's a problem, you either address it or you run away from it. And I think at the moment a lot of people are choosing to run away from the problem by ignoring certain things, hence the less silence comment that was made by Victoria. Why don't we choose to challenge and develop ourselves and the professions involved? Because even though we might think this is a psychological professions only spectrum or problem that's happening in the psychological professions, but it's happening across the whole board. It's happening in socio-demographics all over the place, you know, in other professions as well. So it's something that needs to be addressed urgently.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's a really helpful and important note to end on. Less silence, you know, speaking up and saying what we see, having the courage to do that. And I think that sounds like a really important note. So Matt, do you want to put up the final housekeeping slide? This is the sessions are themed around our different planets. Today's planet has been around uniting and increasing diversity in the psychological professions. If you want to know more about that, I think if we go on to the next slide, Matt. So if you want to know more about this, then please look up the PP Intergalactic Bridge, which is this process of bringing the themed planets of the Psychological Professions Network down to Earth and inviting you to contribute to helping us think about how we shape those into reality. I think we've had a lot of comments come in today. Those are not lost, even those that we haven't been able to respond to directly, and we will take those away and use those to help us think about what we need to do as the Psychological Professions Network, both in the Southeast and nationally, to carry on with the important work of this planet. I've seen one thing pop up in the Slido next to me saying it's worrying that we're still discussing equality, diversity and inclusion in 2021. And I think that's probably a reasonable point to make. I think, wouldn't it be nice to think that there is a future in which we take for granted that this is an issue that doesn't raise its head, and that we don't have to feel that this is still something we have to keep coming back to. For now, thank you all very much for joining us today. Please do give us your feedback on your session. I think that's coming up in the Slido window, so do take a moment to give us your feedback there. We're really interested to hear that, and we will look at that. And also download your certificate of attendance. So I think there's a link below the streaming window where you can click on a button to download your certificate. So do that before you leave. The recording of the session will be put up and will be available, I think, at the end of the conference. So for now, we're going to close for today. Thank you all very much for your attendance. Thank you to thank you to Margot as my co-chair and all of the presenters today. I think it's been a really good session, and look forward to seeing more in the rest of the week. Thank you very much.